You can't open that gate? I'm calling the HOA board. Ma'am, there's a storm coming. I need to get my logging trucks back to base. Too bad. This is private access, and I locked it myself. Yeah, that actually happened. Picture this: sheets of rain, thunder cracking overhead, and Karen in her neon poncho padlocking the only gate out of the valley while my loaded truck sat stranded in floodwater. Smash that like button if you've ever met someone who weaponizes a $12 padlock. Subscribe for more tales of HOA chaos. Because this was the day Karen's obsession with neighborhood control turned into a full-blown street blockade heard around the county. The storm had been building all morning, creeping over the mountains with that heavy quiet that always comes before something fierce. The air felt thick, like the world itself was holding its breath, and every tree along the ridge bent slightly, as if bracing for what was coming. I had been on job sites long enough to know when a drizzle was about to turn into a problem, and this one had the look of trouble written all over it. Clouds stacked themselves in layers of bruised gray and purple, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth even before the first drops began to fall. I told my crew to finish loading as quickly as possible because the road out of the valley had a habit of flooding whenever too much water came down at once. By the time the trucks were rumbling toward the gate, the rain had already started hammering down in sheets, bouncing off hoods and streaking across windshields faster than wipers could keep up. Mud clung to the tires, spraying in arcs with every slow turn of the wheels. The ground vibrated with the combined weight of 3 fully loaded rigs, each one carrying thousands of board feet that needed to be delivered before the roads became rivers. I could feel the tension in the drivers' voices over the radios, short and tight words carrying the kind of urgency that only bad weather creates. It wasn't just the rain that made the scene unsettling. The sky kept splitting open with flashes of light, each bolt followed by the crack of thunder that rolled across the valley like cannon fire. You could almost taste the electricity in the air, sharp and metallic, as if the storm itself was daring anyone to test it. My jacket was already soaked through, water running down the back of my neck, but that was the least of my problems. What mattered was getting those trucks past the gate and onto the county road before the creek rose high enough to cut us off completely. The irony was that in a moment where nature demanded cooperation, the biggest obstacle wasn't the storm itself, but the person who had decided the gate was hers to control. I could see the outline of her bright poncho even through the downpour, a splash of neon standing firm where no one had any business being. Instead of recognizing the danger around us, she looked like she was waiting for a performance to begin, as if the storm was her backdrop and the trucks were props in some twisted play about neighborhood order. That was when I knew this storm was about to become more than weather. It was about to become war. The rain was still light when I noticed her standing near the gate, but something about the way she hovered there set off alarms in my head. Most people in the neighborhood were rushing to tie down patio furniture or dragging garbage bins into garages before the wind picked them up. She, on the other hand, looked like she had been waiting for this exact moment. Her umbrella tilted against the drizzle, clipboard tucked under one arm. She studied my convoy as if she had every right to decide where we could and could not go. At first, I thought she might be checking her own property lines, or maybe just nosy enough to watch us roll past. Yet, the longer I observed her, the clearer it became that her focus was fixed entirely on the trucks. Her eyes followed every movement as the loaders strapped the final logs and the drivers began edging into position. She tapped the pen against her clipboard like she was counting infractions only she could see. It would have been laughable if the storm had not been gathering strength above us, but there was nothing funny about her posture. She wasn't curious, she was guarding something. I recognized the look because I had seen it before, the stare of someone who believes rules exist only to be twisted in their favor. I tried to brush it off, telling myself she would retreat inside once the rain came harder. Yet instead of leaving, she paced the gravel near the gate, her shoes sinking into the softening earth, her gaze darting back to the hinges as though rehearsing what she would do next. One of my drivers leaned out his window and muttered that the gate lady was sizing us up. He was half joking, but the truth behind his words clung to the air. Something about her calm determination unsettled everyone. The storm clouds overhead were heavy with electricity, but the real pressure came from watching her shift her weight from one foot to the other like a sentry on patrol. I had planned for rain delays and muddy roads, but I had not planned for a neighbor treating the only exit like it was her personal border crossing. Still, that was the picture forming as she stood her ground in the drizzle, ready for something more than casual observation. That was the first red flag, the moment when I realized the storm outside was not the only one I was about to face. By the time the rain turned from drizzle to downpour, she made her move. The trucks idled a few yards back, headlights cutting through the sheets of water, when I saw her pull something shiny from her tote bag. At first, I thought it was just another one of her props, maybe a set of oversized keys she liked to jingle for effect. But then the metallic clank reached my ears, and I realized what she had in her hand. A brand new brass padlock gleamed in the stormlight, droplets sliding down its polished surface, as if the rain itself was trying to wash away the absurdity of what she was about to do. She approached the gate with all the pomp of someone performing a sacred ritual. The chain hung loosely through the bars, old but functional, the kind of thing neighbors sometimes used to keep out hunters or stray animals when no one was driving through. She wrapped the links tighter, every twist deliberate, every pull accompanied by a glance over her shoulder to make sure we were watching. Then, with a dramatic flourish, she snapped the lock shut. The sound was sharp and final, echoing louder than the thunder in that moment. It was ridiculous. A grown woman in a neon poncho standing ankle-deep in mud, securing the only exit from the valley like she was protecting a fortress. My drivers stared in disbelief, rain streaking down their faces as if the storm itself was trying to blur the scene so it would make more sense. But there was no mistaking what had just happened. She had sealed us in, not with paperwork or fines, but with cold steel that now separated thousands of dollars worth of cargo from the county road beyond. Her posture shifted immediately after. She tucked the key into her pocket with the pride of a guard who had just secured a prison block. For a moment she simply stood there, chin raised, watching the rainwater stream down the gate like it was part of her triumph. Behind me, one of the drivers revved his engine in frustration, the growl rumbling through the valley, but she didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed to feed off the sound, as though their anger was proof she had won. It was only then that I understood the truth. This wasn't about safety or road conditions. The storm was her stage, and that padlock was the prop she had chosen to prove she held power over everyone else. I stepped closer, the rain dripping from the brim of my hat, and asked her what exactly she thought she was doing. She didn't hesitate. She held up her clipboard like it was a badge and began rattling off a string of phrases that sounded official enough to confuse anyone not paying attention. She spoke of bylaws, of community standards, of prohibitions against industrial vehicles operating on residential access routes. Her voice carried over the storm, sharp and certain, as though the thunder itself was her microphone. For a split second, I almost wondered if she had uncovered some obscure regulation that I had overlooked. But then I caught sight of the paper she was waving. The document wasn't a county notice or a legal order. It wasn't even properly formatted. Bold fonts screamed across the top in Comic Sans, underlined twice for emphasis, as if decoration could replace legitimacy. The text that followed looked like it had been copied from a gardening magazine and twisted into paragraphs about heavy equipment damaging delicate ecosystems. Near the bottom, there were cartoon paw prints framing the phrase, "Approved by Maplewood HOA Safety Council." The kicker was that no such council existed. It was pure fiction, dressed up in pink borders with little cat stickers placed at the corners. She presented it as though she were delivering a court ruling. Every word rolled from her tongue with the smugness of someone who believed authority was something you could invent with a printer and a glue stick. The rain made the ink run, streaking her masterpiece until it looked like the nonsense it was, but she kept shaking the page in the air as though the storm itself should respect her authority. I pointed out that the trucks had a recorded easement on the property, a permanent right to use the road that predated her time in the neighborhood. She ignored me completely. Her attention stayed locked on the drivers, warning them that any attempt to move forward would be met with serious consequences. One of the men muttered a curse under his breath, but none of them dared to challenge her outright. The absurdity of the moment kept everyone still. Watching her stand there, soaked but unyielding, it became clear that this was no misunderstanding. She wasn't misinformed or confused. She was rewriting the rules in real time, convinced that if she said them loudly enough, the storm, the trucks, and even the law itself would bend to her will. Behind me, the trucks rumbled like restless animals trapped in a pen, their headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. The drivers leaned out of their cabs, shoulders hunched against the storm, looking to me for some sign of what to do. These men were used to bad weather, used to long nights on muddy roads and mechanical failures that could grind a day to a halt. But none of them were prepared for the sight of a neighbor in a neon poncho standing in the middle of a storm, declaring herself the gatekeeper of the valley. Their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief and finally to frustration as the reality sank in. One driver shouted over the storm, asking if she was serious, if this was really happening. His words were nearly drowned by the roar of the rain on the truck hoods, but the tone carried clear enough. Another driver leaned on his horn in short blasts, not out of aggression, but out of the sheer absurdity of being told they were trapped by a padlock and a woman with a clipboard. The sound echoed off the wet pines, a low complaint that matched the thunder rolling overhead. Inside the trucks, engines idled heavily, and I could smell the diesel mixing with the sharp scent of rain on hot metal. Every passing minute made the situation worse. Water was already gathering in the ditches along the road, spilling over onto the dirt track we needed to leave by. If the wheels lost traction or the road washed out, the logs would sit there until the sun dried everything out, which could take days. I walked back to the first cab and explained what had just happened, my voice tight with disbelief. The driver shook his head, muttered something about people losing their minds, and gestured toward the rising water. His meaning was clear. We didn't have time for her games. The second driver leaned forward and tapped the steering wheel with his palm in agitation, while the third rolled his window up against the rain, sinking back in his seat with the kind of patience that only came from long experience with impossible delays. The storm didn't care about arguments or bylaws. The trucks were ready, the road was narrowing by the second, and all of us knew that one woman's padlock had just turned a dangerous storm into a manufactured crisis. The creek that cut across the valley had always been unpredictable during heavy weather. Most days it was nothing more than a trickle weaving between stones, the kind of stream you could cross in a single stride without thinking twice. But when the clouds opened up, it changed character in minutes. What had been a calm ribbon of water became a churning brown flood that chewed at the banks and clawed at tree roots. That afternoon, with rain pounding the ground like hammers, I could hear it swelling even before I saw it. The low, steady roar blended with the thunder until it sounded like two storms colliding. I turned toward the bend, where the creek met the road, and felt my stomach sink. Water was already spreading across the gravel, turning the edges into a slurry that looked more like wet clay than anything a truck tire could grip. The puddles shimmered under the headlights, growing larger every time the rain struck the surface. It was clear that, if we didn't get moving soon, the road would vanish under a current too strong for even the heaviest load. The drivers saw it too. One leaned out and pointed toward the water, shouting something I couldn't hear over the storm. His meaning was obvious. The road out was slipping away with every passing second. Engines revved as if the machines themselves were restless, straining to push forward. But all of us were trapped behind a locked gate guarded by a woman who refused to acknowledge what was happening. She didn't even look toward the creek. Her focus stayed on us, arms crossed tightly under her clipboard, as if the world flooding around her didn't exist. It was surreal, standing there soaked through while nature showed its power, and watching her act as if her little lock was the only authority that mattered. Every instinct I had screamed to get the trucks moving before the road gave way completely, but I couldn't ignore the barrier she had created. The storm was no longer just an inconvenience. The rising creek was proof that we were on the edge of being stranded, not for hours, but for days. If the water kept climbing, the logs would be trapped, the trucks immobilized, and the drivers stuck waiting for a break in weather that might never come. And the only person who could not see the danger was the one who believed she was in control. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, shielding the screen from the rain with my hand, and dialed 911. My fingers were cold, the touchscreen slippery, but I managed to punch in the numbers. The dispatcher answered quickly, her voice steady in contrast to the chaos around me. I explained that 3 fully loaded logging trucks were trapped behind a locked gate and that floodwater was rising fast. My words came out sharper than I intended, clipped by urgency, but there was no other way to describe it. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause where you know the person on the other end is trying to process whether you are serious. When she asked me to repeat myself, I clarified. A neighborhood gate had been padlocked shut by the HOA president, and now we were stranded in the middle of a storm. Her tone shifted, carrying both disbelief and concern. I could almost picture her staring at the screen in front of her, deciding which box to find and enter. Check for a problem that probably didn't fit any category in her handbook. She asked if this was an accident, if maybe the lock was meant to keep the gate from blowing open in the wind. I told her no, it had been placed there intentionally by a resident who was still standing in front of us, refusing to let us through. She wanted to know if the person was violent or threatening. I looked at Karen, rain dripping from the bill of her poncho, lips pressed in determination, and answered as honestly as I could. She wasn't violent, but she was blocking critical access during a flood, and that alone made the situation dangerous. I could hear the dispatcher typing, her keyboard clicks faint under the static of the line. She said she would send a unit immediately and asked me to stay on the phone until help arrived. Behind me, the trucks idled louder, the drivers restless, watching water creep closer to their tires. I could smell the mud being churned into the air, a damp, earthy scent mixing with diesel exhaust. Before hanging up, she hesitated and asked again to confirm what she was hearing. Was an HOA leader really preventing trucks from escaping flood conditions? I told her yes, and even through the storm, I could hear her sigh, the kind that carries both disbelief and resignation. Help was on the way, but the absurdity of the situation was already written in her voice. While I was still on the phone with dispatch, she lifted her own device high into the air as if she was holding a torch in the rain. The glow of the screen lit her face, and I realized she wasn't documenting for evidence, she was broadcasting. Her voice rose above the storm, steady and theatrical, the kind of tone people use when they know an audience is watching. She announced to her followers that she was defending the neighborhood from environmental destruction. According to her, the trucks behind me were a menace, tearing apart the community and threatening the road with irreversible damage. She framed herself as the hero in a story that didn't exist, the lone guardian standing against corporate greed. She gestured toward the convoy with sweeping motions, her poncho snapping in the wind like a flag. I could hear the artificial rhythm in her words, practiced lines delivered for dramatic effect. She wasn't worried about the rising water. She wasn't worried about the people sitting in heavy vehicles behind me. She was worried about how many viewers she could gather before the storm knocked out her signal. The surreal part was that she smiled while she said it. Lightning split the sky, and for a brief second, her face lit up in a way that made her look triumphant rather than soaked. She spoke of saving property values and protecting children from the dangers of heavy machinery, all while ankle-deep in runoff that threatened to sweep over her shoes. Her phone stayed fixed at eye level, her arm unwavering, as if the storm was just a special effect added for her broadcast. I caught pieces of her feed as the sound carried over the roar of rain. Words like "brave stand" and "illegal destruction" came out of her mouth with the conviction of someone who had decided truth was optional. The drivers behind me leaned out their windows, shouting their disbelief, but she didn't even flinch. Their frustration only seemed to fuel her performance. At one point, she turned directly toward the camera and declared that she alone was preventing catastrophe, that without her intervention, the neighborhood would be ruined. The irony was painful. The actual catastrophe was swelling just beyond the gate, and she was too busy auditioning for applause to notice. As her performance continued, the glow of house lights began to appear one by one along the street. Curtains shifted, blinds tilted, and the outlines of neighbors pressed against windows came into view. The storm had already woken most of them, but now they had a spectacle to watch. Even through the pounding rain, I could sense the collective disbelief spreading from porch to porch. A man across the way stepped out under his awning, coffee mug still in hand, rain dripping from the brim of his baseball cap. He didn't shout or interfere, just stood there, shaking his head, like he had seen this exact show before and knew better than to argue. 2 houses down, a couple huddled beneath an umbrella, phones raised as they recorded the scene. Their faces were lit by the screen's glow, wide-eyed and incredulous, as if they couldn't believe what they were capturing in real time. The storm didn't slow Karen down at all. If anything, the presence of an audience pushed her to double down. She raised her voice even louder, projecting phrases about safety and community preservation. Her poncho flapped wildly in the wind, sticking to her arms and snapping free again, and still, she never looked away from her phone. The rain ran down her face, but she wore it like a badge of courage for the show she was producing. One by one, doors opened, despite the downpour. People came out to their porches, some with umbrellas, some simply letting themselves get soaked, all of them drawn by the absurdity unfolding at the gate. Their murmurs carried through the storm, a low current of amusement mixed with irritation. A few laughed openly when they saw the padlock glinting under the headlights. Others muttered questions I couldn't make out, but the tone was clear. They were tired of the drama, yet unwilling to look away. From the trucks behind me, horns sounded again, sharp bursts that echoed across the valley and made windows rattle. The noise drew even more people outside. It was no longer just Karen and my crew. The entire street had become a reluctant audience to her act, and in the chaos of rain, thunder, and floodwater, the line between natural disaster and neighborhood theater blurred completely. She wanted attention, and now she had it, though not in the way she imagined. The storm had turned the valley into a theater of noise and light when blue flashes joined the chaos. The wail of a siren cut through the rain, and every head along the street turned as a sheriff's SUV slid into view, tires spitting mud. The headlights caught the gate, the trucks, and finally Karen standing tall in her drenched poncho, gripping her phone like a trophy. Relief washed over me for a split second. Finally, someone with real authority had arrived to put an end to the madness. The SUV door opened, and the sheriff stepped out, boots sinking into the mud with a dull thud. He adjusted his hat against the wind, his jacket already glistening with water, and took in the scene in a slow sweep. His gaze moved from the trucks rumbling in frustration to the locked gate dripping under the rain, and then settled on Karen, who looked as if she had been waiting for this grand entrance all along. She wasted no time. Before he even had the chance to ask a question, she raised her voice above the storm and launched into her speech. She pointed toward the trucks with an accusing finger, announcing that she had single-handedly stopped an environmental catastrophe. Her words rolled out, rehearsed, and polished, sprinkled with phrases about community safety and property values. She spoke as if she were addressing a jury rather than the sheriff standing a few feet away. The drivers revved their engines behind me, a deep growl that made the ground tremble, but Karen acted as if the noise was applause. She gestured dramatically toward the rising water and claimed she had prevented us from destroying the neighborhood road. Every word came coated with the confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. The sheriff listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. His eyes narrowed slightly as she waved her dripping clipboard in the air, the ink bleeding across the pages, yet he gave no reaction. He simply stood there in the rain, arms crossed, boots planted, as thunder rolled overhead. The silence between her declarations seemed to stretch longer than it should have, and for a moment the entire street held its breath, waiting to see which way he would lean. Karen's words tumbled out so fast, it was as though she had been rehearsing them in front of a mirror for weeks. She listed off supposed violations with the precision of a prosecutor, her finger jabbing toward the trucks as if each point were a nail sealing our fate. According to her, the vehicles were destroying common property, lowering neighborhood safety, and endangering children who might someday walk this road. She invoked every dramatic phrase she could think of, layering her argument with a mix of panic and pride. It was a performance as much as an accusation, and the storm only amplified her voice, thunder crashing like punctuation behind every outburst. The sheriff did not move. He stood in the rain, his hat pulled low, water dripping from the brim, arms folded against his chest. His silence gave her confidence, and she took it as a sign that her lecture was working. She flipped through the pages on her clipboard, each one smudged with rain until the ink bled into blurry streaks, yet she held them high like sacred texts. She quoted imaginary codes and bylaws, none of which matched anything the county had ever written, but she delivered them with such force it almost felt like they had weight. The drivers shifted impatiently in their seats, one of them muttering loud enough for me to hear that she should take her speech to Broadway. Another leaned on his horn for a short blast, the sound sharp enough to make a few neighbors flinch. Karen whipped her head around, glaring at the trucks as if their frustration were proof of their guilt. She turned back to the sheriff and demanded immediate citations, even arrest if possible, her voice cracking under the strain of shouting against the storm. The rain plastered her hair to her forehead, and her poncho clung tightly to her arms, but she held her ground like a soldier in battle. She believed she had cornered us, that her authority would carry more weight than the rising flood at our backs. Through it all, the sheriff kept that same, unreadable expression, His eyes flicked from her soggy papers to the gate, then back to me, standing with mud up to my boots. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were rain on metal, engines rumbling, and Karen's breathless certainty echoing into the storm. The sheriff let her words run their course without interruption. His patience had the weight of someone who had seen a lifetime of neighborhood squabbles and knew that sometimes silence spoke louder than argument. He shifted his stance slightly, water dripping off the brim of his hat, and turned his attention toward me. The look he gave was not one of accusation, but of quiet inquiry, a subtle tilt of the head that asked for my side without needing words. I stepped forward, boots sinking deeper into the mud, and held out my folder of documents. The rain had dampened the edges, but the ink remained clear enough to read. Inside was the easement agreement that granted my company permanent right-of-way through that gate, a legal arrangement that had existed long before any HOA had been formed in the valley. The sheriff took the papers, his fingers steady despite the storm, and began flipping through them with the practiced eye of a man who had read too many disputes reduced to paper. Karen immediately tried to interrupt, her voice rising higher than the thunder. She insisted the documents were forged, claimed they were outdated, and even suggested that I had tricked the county clerk into signing off on them. Each accusation grew more desperate, but the sheriff did not look at her. He studied the signature lines, traced the dates, and let the evidence speak louder than her shrill protests. For the first time that night, I saw the faintest change in his expression. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest clarity. He folded the papers carefully, slid them back into the folder, and handed it to me with a quiet nod. That gesture alone said more than any speech. Karen faltered. Her voice cracked mid-sentence, and for a heartbeat she looked less like a warrior and more like a child caught in a lie. The rain plastered her notes against the board until they sagged and peeled away, exposing how flimsy they really were. Around us, neighbors whispered, their confidence shifting with the sheriff's calm recognition. The silence that followed was almost as loud as the storm. For the first time since the trucks had been stopped, the balance of power tilted away from her performance and toward the truth resting in my hands. I held the folder tight against my chest, careful not to let the rain soak through any further. The easement paperwork had been in my family's records for years, a document passed from one owner to the next, like a shield meant for moments just like this. I opened it again for the sheriff and pointed to the section that mattered most. The language was clear. The road leading through the gate was designated for unrestricted use by my company and its vehicles. No condition, no loophole, no hidden clause gave anyone else authority to interfere. The date stretched back decades, stamped with the county seal that had never once been contested. The sheriff leaned closer, his gloved hand brushing the page, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the legal phrases out loud for everyone to hear. His voice carried through the rain, steady and unshakable, reciting the rights granted to the land and the obligations that came with them. Each sentence was like a hammer driving nails into the flimsy framework Karen had tried to build. Neighbors gathered closer under umbrellas, drawn in by the rhythm of his words, some nodding, as if finally seeing the truth for the first time. Karen stood stiffly by the gate, her arms wrapped tight around her clipboard as if she could squeeze authority back into it. She shook her head, her voice trembling as she insisted that no paper could override her responsibility to protect the neighborhood. She called it her duty, her calling, her role as guardian. But the sheriff cut her off with a single raised hand, the first gesture of authority he had made since arriving. His voice stayed calm but firm when he told her the documents were legitimate and binding. The drivers behind me leaned out of their cabs, catching enough of the words to finally relax their shoulders. Engines idled lower, no longer roaring with frustration, as if the machines themselves had been waiting for permission to breathe. I felt the weight in my chest ease as well. The proof I had carried through storms and meetings and endless arguments had done its job. In that moment, the storm seemed to pause, the rain softening just enough for the sheriff's words to linger in the air. The easement was not just ink on paper. It was the undeniable truth that shattered her illusion of power. Karen's voice sharpened when she realized the sheriff was not siding with her. She clutched her clipboard tighter, the papers already ruined by the storm, and began throwing out wild accusations. She said the signatures on my easement were faked, that the county clerk was corrupt, that my entire business was part of a conspiracy to ruin her neighborhood. Her eyes darted from me to the sheriff to the trucks, as if she could find some sign that her story was sticking. But the rain kept running down her face, and the more she shouted, the more desperate she sounded. Her words stumbled over one another, growing louder but less coherent. She accused me of bribing local officials, of secretly plotting to pave the valley into a parking lot, and at one point even claimed that I had somehow engineered the storm itself to force my way through. Thunder rolled at just the right moment, and a flash of lightning made her silhouette look wild against the gate. For the neighbors who had gathered, the timing only made her rant seem more unhinged. The sheriff listened just long enough to be certain she was finished, his expression calm and steady. When she finally ran out of breath, he told her firmly that the matter had already been clarified. The easement was valid, the trucks had the right to pass. He said it with such finality that even the drivers behind me could hear it through the roar of the engines and the rain. Karen's shoulders stiffened. For a moment she stood frozen, gripping her clipboard as though it could anchor her against the truth. Her face twisted between rage and disbelief, and her voice cracked when she shouted that none of us understood what was at stake. She insisted the neighborhood would collapse under the weight of the trucks, that children would never be safe again, that she alone had been brave enough to stand against destruction. But the neighbors were no longer convinced. Murmurs spread through the small crowd. Some shook their heads, others whispered that she had gone too far this time. The storm had given her a stage, but the performance was unraveling in front of everyone. She had built her case on bluster, and now the storm itself seemed to underline how little weight her words carried. The tension in the air grew heavier than the storm itself. The trucks behind me were no longer idling patiently. Engines roared in low, steady bursts as the drivers grew restless. They had been sitting in the rain for nearly an hour, watching water creep closer to their wheels, and patience was wearing thin. One of them leaned on his horn, the blaring sound vibrating through the valley like a challenge. Another revved his engine in response, the growl deep and angry. Soon all three joined in, their combined noise rattling the windows of the houses nearby. Karen spun toward them with a look of outrage, her poncho plastered to her arms, her hair slicked to her cheeks. She shouted over the roar, warning the drivers that, if they dared move forward, she would take them to court. She threatened lawsuits, fines, even personal bankruptcy. Her words were swallowed almost completely by the thunder of engines, yet her body language made her intent clear. She stood in the mud, waving her clipboard like a sword, pointing at each cab as though she could force compliance with sheer will. The drivers did not flinch. I saw one of them grin through the windshield, a tired, humorless smile that told me he had faced worse than this. Another tapped his steering wheel in rhythm with the revs, letting the machine answer for him. It was not aggression so much as defiance, a collective reminder that no padlock or speech could intimidate a convoy built to move thousands of pounds through rough country. The storm added its own voice, lightning flashing across the sky in jagged lines and thunder answering seconds later. Rain hammered the hoods and windshields until it poured off the sides in sheets. Mud splashed under the wheels as the trucks shifted in place, heavy frames rocking forward just enough to make the ground tremble. The vibration carried through my boots and into the soaked earth, a physical warning that they would not sit idle forever. Karen screamed louder, but her voice cracked under the strain. She was no longer leading a show for her audience. She was fighting against machines, men, and a storm that would not wait for her approval. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked small against the rumble of steel and thunder surrounding her. The sheriff had stood quietly long enough. The air was thick with diesel fumes, rainwater, and the low thunder of engines ready to break free. Karen's shouts had turned hoarse, her clipboard a soggy mess pressed against her chest, yet she still refused to back down. She clung to that lock like it was the last barrier holding back chaos, and in her mind, she was the only one standing between order and ruin. But the creek was spilling higher, the mud was deepening, and the trucks were seconds away from becoming stranded. Without ceremony, the sheriff turned and walked to his vehicle. For a moment I wondered if he was giving up, leaving us to argue until the storm decided the outcome. Instead, he returned carrying a pair of heavy bolt cutters. Their black handles gleamed with rain as he positioned them against the brass lock. The metal squealed under the pressure, a sharp note that cut through the storm. Karen gasped, lunging forward with a cry, but the sheriff's arm held steady. With a single firm squeeze, the lock snapped clean in two. The sound of breaking steel rang louder than the thunder for that instant. Karen's scream followed immediately, raw and piercing. She staggered back as though he had destroyed something priceless, clutching the broken lock in her hands as if it were a relic. "That was community property," she shrieked, though everyone knew she had bought it at the hardware store the day before. Her outrage echoed across the street, bouncing off the houses where neighbors stood, watching with a mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. The gate swung open with a groan, its hinges straining under the sudden release. Water rushed past the wheels of the trucks as if waiting for that moment, and the drivers wasted no time. Engines revved higher, and headlights flared against the curtain of rain. The sheriff stepped back, his face calm, letting the vehicles claim the road that had always been theirs by right. The scene shifted in an instant. What had been a standoff became motion, 3 massive trucks rolling forward into the storm with the power of inevitability. Karen's voice chased after them, but her protest sounded smaller now, drowned out by engines, thunder, and the undeniable finality of the lock lying broken in the mud. The moment the gate creaked open, it was as though the storm had been waiting for its cue. Water surged forward, spilling across the road in a rush that carried sticks, leaves, and clumps of mud. The trucks lurched into motion one by one, their headlights cutting bright paths through the curtain of rain. Tires spun briefly before catching traction, flinging arcs of dirty water high into the air as each rig powered ahead. The engines roared with determination, echoing off the valley walls like a promise that nothing could hold them back now. I stepped aside as the first truck barreled past, the ground trembling beneath its weight. The driver gripped the wheel tight, his face set in the glow of the dashboard. Mud splashed across the side of the cab, streaking the paint with earthy scars, but he kept the rig steady. Behind him, the second truck followed close, its trailer rattling as the water rose higher. The road had already become a shallow river, and the current clawed at the wheels with every rotation. Karen stood to the side of the gate, drenched and shouting into her phone, her words torn apart by the storm. Her voice no longer sounded commanding. It sounded desperate, like someone realizing their performance had lost its audience. The trucks ignored her completely, their horns blasting long and low as they pushed through the flood. Each note rolled through the valley like a declaration that the blockade was over. The third truck was nearly caught by the surge. A wave slammed against its tires, pushing it sideways just enough to make the trailer tilt. The driver floored the accelerator, mud spraying in every direction until the vehicle straightened and surged forward with a final groan of effort. Neighbors gasped under their umbrellas, watching the convoy escape into the night. The water kept rushing behind them, filling the ruts in the road, but it no longer mattered. The path was open, and the loads were moving. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the relief as heavy as the rain, still soaking my jacket. The lock lay broken in the mud, the trucks had broken free, and the storm had claimed the road in their wake. Karen was not finished. Even after the trucks had pushed through the flood and disappeared into the curtain of rain, she planted herself squarely in the middle of the street. Her neon poncho clung to her like a flag wrapped too tightly around a pole, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her phone still raised high, as if documenting her own act of defiance. Instead of retreating to the safety of her home, she chose the flooded road as her stage, arms waving wildly to stop the next wave of vehicles that might come through. Her SUV sat parked just beyond the gate, angled across the narrow street in a way that blocked both directions. The headlights glowed dimly through the rain, casting long beams across the slick pavement, and the hazard lights flashed like warning beacons. But it was no warning for safety, it was a barricade. Delivery vans, neighbors, even emergency vehicles would not have been able to pass if they needed to. Her blockade was as complete as it was reckless. The sound of horns rose again, but this time, they were not from my trucks. A neighbor trying to drive home pressed down, the sharp notes echoing off the wet houses. Another car joined in, headlights flashing impatiently, but Karen only stood taller, raising her free hand like a conductor silencing an orchestra. She mouthed words about protecting the community, her voice barely audible over the storm, yet her gestures carried enough arrogance that everyone watching understood her intent. She believed she had regained control, that by standing in the road with her car as reinforcement, she could undo what the sheriff had already resolved. The rain hammered down harder, sheets of water running past her feet and swirling around the tires of her SUV. The current tugged at debris, pulling sticks and leaves against the bumper, but she ignored it. Her entire focus was on the crowd now gathering along the porches and sidewalks. Neighbors stood under umbrellas and hoods, their faces tight with disbelief. Some shouted for her to move. Others simply recorded the scene, shaking their heads. She was no longer just an inconvenience. By blocking the street after the trucks had gone, she turned herself into the very danger she claimed to be fighting. The storm was still raging, but the greater flood now came from the frustration of every resident forced to witness her final, stubborn stand. The trucks had vanished into the storm, but the chaos they left behind was nothing compared to what Karen created next. Her SUV, parked sideways across the narrow stretch of asphalt, had become a wall no one could move around. The rain poured harder, drumming against the metal roof of the vehicle and splashing off the growing streams that twisted down the street. The hazard lights kept blinking, red flashes bouncing across wet pavement, a warning that meant nothing useful to anyone. Cars began to line up on both sides of the barricade. A delivery van carrying groceries idled impatiently, its driver leaning on the horn. A neighbor returning from work slowed to a stop, headlights cutting across the rain-soaked figure of Karen, still standing defiantly beside her vehicle. The storm was enough to keep most people indoors, but frustration had pulled a handful of neighbors back out onto their porches. They stood with umbrellas or hoods pulled low, staring at the ridiculous blockade that was trapping everyone on their own street. Water was already rising high enough to cover the edges of the tires on her SUV, but Karen ignored it. She held her phone high again, recording a new video. Her voice rose above the horns and the storm as she claimed she was protecting the neighborhood from reckless drivers, from unsafe conditions, from outsiders who had no right to be there. Each declaration sounded less convincing than the one before, but she carried on as though her audience could not see the obvious truth. She was the only one causing a problem. The sheriff shook his head, speaking quietly into his radio, while the crowd of soaked neighbors grew louder. A woman yelled that she was late for work. A man shouted about a prescription waiting at the pharmacy. Another voice complained that their child's school bus would not be able to get through in the morning. Every shout added to the weight pressing down on the street, a storm of human impatience matching the one falling from the sky. Karen stayed put, framed in the blinking red light of her own SUV, as if daring anyone to challenge her barricade. The storm no longer seemed like the main threat. The entire road had been turned into a gridlock stage for one person's stubborn need to be in control. The street that had once echoed only with the storm was now alive with voices. Neighbors poured from their porches and front doors, no longer content to watch from behind curtains. Rain slicked their jackets and plastered hair to their foreheads, but irritation overpowered discomfort. People shouted over the roar of the downpour, their words colliding with the blaring horns of trapped cars. The frustration that had been simmering for weeks under Karen's endless interference finally spilled over. One man, clutching an umbrella that bent under the wind, called out for her to move her SUV so he could get home to his family. His voice cracked with anger, and others quickly joined in. A woman yelled about groceries spoiling in the back of her car. Another neighbor shouted that they had missed a delivery last week because she had pulled a similar stunt. Their voices overlapped, a chorus of exasperation rising above the storm. Karen tried to answer them, raising her phone high again, as if her live audience mattered more than the people standing only a few feet away. She spoke about safety and responsibility, claiming she was the only one willing to defend the community. But her words no longer carried the same authority. The neighbors who had once stayed quiet or avoided confrontation now pressed forward, calling out her behavior for what it was. Their anger stripped away the image she tried to project, leaving only the stubborn figure of a woman blocking her own street. The sheriff stood nearby, his arms folded, watching the crowd swell against her. His presence alone kept the situation from boiling into chaos, but even he seemed to understand that patience had worn thin. He glanced at her SUV, then back at the group of residents, his jaw set in the kind of expression that meant a decision was coming. The horns from the idling vehicles added to the pressure. Headlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting long beams across Karen's poncho and the flashing hazards of her SUV. Neighbors edged closer, shouting louder, their frustration no longer muted by fear of her authority. The storm had brought them all together, and for the first time, it was clear that Karen no longer held control. The weight of an entire street had turned against her, and she stood alone, drowning not in water but in the flood of voices demanding she step aside. Karen's poncho clung to her like a second skin as she stood in the middle of the road, refusing to move even as the storm pounded harder. Her hair stuck to her cheeks, her phone was still raised high, and her voice rang out like she was delivering a speech to an invisible jury. She spoke about how she had been chosen to defend the community, how she was the only one willing to sacrifice her comfort for the greater good. The words carried the same cadence as a campaign rally, but the crowd in front of her was not cheering. The neighbors who had gathered were no longer patient listeners. They shouted back at her, their voices raw with the strain of yelling through the downpour. Some told her to stop embarrassing herself, others begged her to get out of the road before someone was hurt. A man holding a soaked baseball cap yelled that his wife needed to get to work, and another neighbor demanded to know who gave her the right to block traffic. The frustration pressed in on her from every direction, but she only lifted her chin higher, as if defiance alone could keep the storm of voices from breaking her. Her SUV loomed behind her, angled across the street like a barrier she had planted in the ground. Its hazard lights flashed rhythmically, reflecting off the water, streaming down the pavement. Each blink of red light made the scene feel more surreal, as though the storm itself had conspired to spotlight her final stand. The sound of horns blaring from trapped vehicles joined the rhythm, each note sharper and more insistent, pushing the tension higher. The sheriff gave her one last warning, his voice steady but carrying enough weight to silence the shouting for a moment. He told her to move her vehicle before it was towed, reminded her that she was obstructing not only her neighbors but emergency access as well. She ignored him, muttering into her phone as if the live stream was the only authority that mattered. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the entire street froze. The rain poured, the hazards blinked, the horns wailed, and there she stood, unyielding in her belief that she could outlast everyone. But the faces around her told another story. The patience of the neighborhood had ended, and the law was preparing to act. The sheriff's patience finally ran out. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the muddy street, and spoke with the kind of tone that cut through rain, horns, and shouting alike. He told her plainly that this was her last opportunity to move her vehicle on her own. His words carried no anger, only the steady weight of authority that comes from someone who has given too many warnings before. The neighbors fell quiet, straining to hear over the storm, their faces tense with anticipation. Karen's response was to fold her arms across her soaked clipboard and tilt her head defiantly. She said she would not move an inch, that the road was her responsibility, and that she would face whatever consequences came. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she masked it with a half-laugh, the kind of sound people make when they are trying to convince themselves they still hold the upper hand. The sheriff gave a subtle nod, then turned back toward his radio. Within minutes, headlights appeared through the sheets of rain. A tow truck rumbled into view, its yellow beacon lights flashing across the wet pavement. The sight alone sent a ripple through the crowd. Some neighbors began clapping, others shouted encouragement, and a few pulled out their phones to record what was about to happen. Karen spun around, her composure unraveling. She shouted that this was illegal, that the sheriff had no right, that the tow truck driver would face charges if he so much as touched her SUV. Her words were drowned out by the clank of heavy chains as the driver stepped from his cab, unfazed by her performance. He worked quickly, shoulders hunched against the downpour, hooking steel under the front bumper with the precision of someone who had done this countless times. The hazard lights of her SUV continued to flash, but the blinking rhythm no longer looked like control. It looked like surrender. The truck's engine roared as the winch tightened, lifting the front wheels off the ground. Karen screamed over the sound, a high-pitched mix of rage and disbelief, but the scene had shifted beyond her reach. The sheriff watched with arms folded, the neighbors cheered louder, and the storm pressed on as the barrier she had built was finally being removed, piece by piece. The chains tightened, and her SUV began to rise, its front wheels lifting off the wet pavement with a groan of protest. The tow truck's winch hummed steadily, indifferent to the storm and the shouting that filled the street. Karen darted toward the driver, waving her arms wildly, but the sheriff stepped between them with a calm firmness that kept her from interfering. She stomped in the mud, her poncho clinging like a flag of defeat, yet still she shouted into her phone, documenting every moment as though her live stream could undo what was happening right in front of her. The neighbors erupted in cheers as the vehicle shifted higher. Applause broke out under umbrellas, whistles pierced the rain, and the blaring horns of trapped cars joined in, transforming frustration into celebration. It felt like a release of pressure that had been building for months. The storm had drowned their patience, but the sight of the barricade finally being dragged away was enough to spark joy even in the downpour. A man with a baseball cap raised both fists in the air, his soaked jacket sticking to his back as he yelled that justice had finally arrived. Children who had been watching from windows pressed closer to the glass, their faces lit with wide-eyed wonder at the flashing lights and the spectacle of a car being hauled away in the middle of a storm. The entire neighborhood had been pulled into the moment, the line between chaos and entertainment blurring as laughter mixed with the thunder. The sheriff, unmoved by the commotion, simply kept his eyes on the tow truck driver, making sure the work continued without interruption. Karen's voice grew shrill, her protests dissolving into half-sentences as she tried to argue with everyone at once. She shouted at the sheriff, accused the neighbors of betrayal, and swore the tow company would regret this, all while her car was dragged inch by inch toward the truck. Her words no longer held any authority. They were swept away by the cheer of a community that had finally had enough. As the SUV tilted and settled against the steel cradle, the rain streaked its windows, reflecting the flashing amber lights of the tow truck. The fat horns quieted, the applause softened, but the energy in the air remained electric. For the first time that night, the street felt lighter. The blockade was gone, and with it, the illusion of control she had tried so hard to maintain. When the tow truck pulled away, the street transformed almost instantly. The horns that had been blaring quieted, replaced by the steady hum of engines finally free to move forward. Drivers leaned out their windows to thank the sheriff, their voices carrying relief more than anger. The convoy of stranded cars began rolling past, headlights cutting through the storm like a slow parade of liberation. Each passing vehicle sent ripples of water sliding across the pavement, washing away the tension that had clung to the neighborhood all night. Neighbors lingered in the rain, unwilling to retreat indoors just yet. Someone brought out a box of donuts from their porch, handing them around to wet hands. Another neighbor set a thermos of coffee on the hood of their car, pouring steaming cups that mixed with the scent of diesel and wet earth. Despite the hour, the mood felt almost celebratory, as though the storm itself had been conquered along with Karen's barricade. Laughter broke out in small bursts, carried between umbrellas and hoods. People shook their heads in disbelief, retelling the events in short snippets as if trying to make sense of the absurdity they had witnessed. A woman repeated that she still could not believe the sheriff had to cut a padlock in the middle of a flood. A man leaned on his fence, laughing that he had never seen a car towed away under lightning before. Every retelling of the night's chaos turned Karen's defiance into a story that already felt like legend. The rain softened for a moment, and in that pause, the valley seemed calmer. The sound of rushing water from the creek continued in the distance, but it no longer carried the same threat. The road was clear, the trucks had escaped, and the neighborhood had survived the storm with a tale none of them would soon forget. Karen had retreated indoors by then, her figure vanishing behind her doorway with nothing left to hold. Her presence was missed only in the sense that her absence finally allowed the community to exhale. For the first time all night, the street belonged to the neighbors again. They stood together in the fading storm, united not by fear, but by the strange relief that comes when chaos finally breaks and ordinary life feels possible again. In the days that followed, the story spread faster than the storm clouds that had rolled through that night. Neighbors retold it over fences and coffee cups, each version carrying a little more humor than fear. What had felt tense and dangerous in the rain became the kind of tale people shared with laughter, shaking their heads at the memory of a woman who thought a padlock could control a flood and a convoy of trucks. Children repeated the story to each other at the bus stop, embellishing details until Karen's poncho was described as a cape and the tow truck as a knight's steed. The absurdity of it all gave the neighborhood a shared language, something to reference whenever small inconveniences cropped up. Karen's reputation changed almost overnight. She was no longer simply the HOA president with a clipboard. She became the woman who locked logging trucks in a storm, the neighbor who tried to hold back a flood with her SUV, the person who had transformed a rain-soaked night into a spectacle the entire valley witnessed. The label followed her everywhere, whispered at the grocery store, and chuckled over at community gatherings. Even people who had once defended her methods found themselves unable to excuse what they had seen with their own eyes. Her live streams, which she had once used as a tool for authority, became evidence of her downfall. Clips circulated among the residents, each one replayed with commentary and laughter. The moment the lock snapped, the way her voice cracked, the flashing hazard lights as her SUV was hauled away, every second was captured and remembered. What she thought was proof of her leadership became a permanent reminder of her stubbornness. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood discovered a sense of unity that had been missing. For too long, they had been divided by fear of fines and endless complaints. But standing together in the rain, cheering as the barricade was removed, gave them something stronger than rules or paperwork. It gave them perspective. They saw how fragile control could be when it was built on intimidation rather than trust. Karen had tried to build her power with locks and speeches. What remained after the storm was a legacy she never intended, a cautionary tale retold with laughter every time thunder rolled in the distance. And that's how one padlock in a storm turned into the greatest HOA fail my county has ever seen. Karen wanted control, but all she managed to do was block her own street, lose her SUV, and go viral as the woman who fought logging trucks with a clipboard. If you've stuck with me this far, you deserve a medal, or at least a dry jacket. Hit subscribe for more stories of entitled neighbors meeting unstoppable karma. Drop a comment if you've ever had a stormy showdown with a Karen, because sometimes the rain isn't the scariest thing in the neighborhood. And remember, weather can be unpredictable, but HOA Karens, they're practically guaranteed.